The fluorescent tube buzzed overhead. Margaret's recipe ledger lay open on my workbench, grease-stained pages curling under the flat white light. 30 years of her handwriting. Brisket rubs, coleslaw dressings, pie crusts for every season. Then the recipes stopped. Past the holiday specials, her cursive changed. Tighter, urgent, a notarized clause. Vendor names circled in red with dollar amounts that didn't match anything I'd ever ordered. And one line in her hand, "He's stealing from us." My hands stopped shaking. Please subscribe and share where in the world you're watching from right now. Your support keeps these stories coming. I built the best barbecue restaurant in the state of Tennessee with nothing but scrap metal, hickory smoke, and a woman who could stretch a dollar until it screamed. My name is Virgil Stegman. I'm 63 years old. That was 1993. I was 32, working construction during the week and spending every free hour in a salvage yard outside Murfreesboro, cutting apart decommissioned oil drums with a plasma torch I borrowed from a friend who owed me a favor. 2 drums, a steel plate I cut for the firebox door, and 60 hours of welding in a rented garage. When I was done, I had an offset smoker that weighed 800 pounds and held heat like a vault. I hitched it to the back of a converted horse trailer I'd bought for $1,100 at auction, towed the whole rig to a gravel lot off Route 11, and opened for business on a Saturday morning in April. The gravel lot belonged to a man named Earl Cutler, who owned a feed store across the road. Earl let me park there for $200 a month and a plate of pulled pork every Friday. I paid him in cash from a cigar box. Margaret ran the cigar box. My wife, Margaret Stegman, was a former school teacher who'd left the classroom when our daughter Kristen was born in 1988, but never stopped thinking like one. She could look at a stack of receipts and tell you where every penny went. The way a mechanic listens to an engine and knows which cylinder is misfiring. That first summer on the gravel lot, she sat in a folding chair under a canvas awning with the cigar box on her lap, making change, tracking sales on a yellow legal pad, and filing our first business license in a manila folder she'd labeled in her exact, upright handwriting. Stegman's Smokehouse. We sold pulled pork sandwiches for $3, brisket plates for $5, sweet tea from a 5-gallon cooler. Margaret brewed every morning at 4 a.m. On a good Saturday, we'd clear $200. On a bad one, we ate the leftovers ourselves, and Margaret adjusted the next week's meat order down by 10 pounds. 3 years of that. 3 years of gravel dust and heat stroke, and nights when I'd fall asleep at the kitchen table with my boots still on, too tired to climb the stairs. Margaret never complained. She'd pull off my boots, set them by the door, and leave a glass of water where I'd find it in the morning. In 1996, I poured the parking lot. I'd saved enough for a concrete mixer rental and 40 bags of mix. Margaret calculated the square footage, the thickness, the cure time. I spent 3 weekends on my knees with a screed board, leveling that slab until it was flat enough to set a marble on. The wet mix smelled like chalk and rain, and the screed board scraped against it with a sound like a blade on a whetstone. When it dried, I stood on it and felt something shift inside me. Not pride. Ownership. I'd put that concrete into the earth with my own hands, and nobody could take it out. The building came next. I laid the brick myself, course by course, over 7 months. Margaret drew the floor plan on graph paper at the kitchen table, measuring twice, erasing, measuring again. She wanted 120 seats. I told her she was out of her mind. She said she wasn't planning for next year. She was planning for the next 30. She was right. She was always right about the numbers. By 2000, Stegman's Smokehouse had 120 seats, a hand-lettered chalkboard menu Margaret updated every morning, and a line out the door on Friday nights. Senators ate at the same tables as truck drivers. The fire department came every Tuesday. Rehearsal dinners, retirement parties. After a funeral, half the county ended up at our counter with a plate of brisket and a glass of sweet tea. Because that's what you did. You came to Stegman's. Margaret built a dedication wall by the entrance. A framed photograph of us standing in front of the original smoker on opening day, squinting into the sun, me in a stained apron, and her in a denim shirt with the cigar box under her arm. Beside it, a wooden plaque she'd had carved by a man in Lynchburg, built by hand, served with heart. Every customer who walked through that door passed it. In 2004, a franchise company out of Atlanta offered us $2 million for the Stegman name. They wanted to put our logo on restaurants in 6 states. I sat at the kitchen table with the offer letter, reading the numbers, feeling the weight of $2 million. Margaret picked up the letter, read it once, and set it back down. Our name means something because it's on 1 building, she said. Put it on 6, and it doesn't mean anything at all. I put the letter in the recycling. That was the end of it. That was our partnership. I built everything you could touch. The smoker, the brick, the concrete, the corrugated tin roof over the back patio where I tended the fire. Margaret built everything you couldn't see. The books, the permits, the tax filings, the family trust she structured with an attorney in Nashville, handling legal details I never fully understood but never needed to, because she understood them for both of us. She'd sit at the counter after closing, tutoring neighborhood kids who came in with math homework and empty stomachs, feeding them brisket ends while she walked them through long division. I'd watch her from the kitchen pass, this woman who could track every dollar in a 30-year business and still make time to help a 12-year-old with fractions. I married the smartest person I ever met, and the luckiest thing I ever did was recognize it. 30 years. That's how long we ran that restaurant together. 30 years of 4 a.m. mornings and midnight cleanings, of adjusting recipes for humidity and wood moisture, of reading smoke color, the way other people read weather. I knew that smoker the way I knew my own hands, temperature by touch, doneness by feel, the difference between good smoke and bad smoke by the color alone. Blue meant clean combustion. White meant wet wood. Gray meant trouble. And then, 6 years before everything fell apart, my daughter Kristen came home from a Nashville food festival with a man named Troy Vandermeer. She was 30 years old. Troy was 32. Restaurant consultant. Hospitality management degree from some school I'd never heard of. He wore slim-fit chinos and a polo shirt to a barbecue restaurant. And when he shook my hand, I knew. No calluses, no grip. Fingers soft as a church hymnal. A man's handshake tells you what his hands have done. Troy's hands had done nothing. I filed it away, said nothing. Kristen was smiling, in a way I hadn't seen since her high school graduation, and Margaret squeezed my arm at the dinner table and gave me the look. The look that said, "Be patient. She's happy. That matters more than your opinion of his handshake." So I was patient. Troy played the dutiful son-in-law, 2 years of it before the wedding, then 2 more after. He complimented my brisket technique with the specific vocabulary of a man who'd studied it from textbooks. He called Margaret Mom by the second Christmas. He asked smart questions about the business, vendor relationships, supplier contracts, payment structures, profit margins, and framed every question as interest in the family legacy. "I just want to understand what you've built here, Virgil," he'd say, leaning against the kitchen door frame with a coffee mug in his soft hand. "This place is special. I want to help protect it." Margaret nodded along. She never showed him the trust documents. Troy and Kristen married in the spring of 2020. By then, Troy had taken over front-of-house management and was suggesting menu adjustments. Smaller portions, higher prices, a cocktail program to attract younger customers. He talked about revenue numbers, the way I talked about smoke rings. Different priorities. I attributed it to a different generation's approach to the restaurant business and kept my mouth shut. I shouldn't have, but I didn't know that yet. None of us did. Not until Margaret got sick. Pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis arrived in April 2022, and my world contracted to the size of a hospital room. Stage 3. Aggressive. The oncologist used words like treatment options and quality of life considerations, and I sat in a plastic chair holding Margaret's hand while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and everything I'd built for 30 years became background noise. I stepped away from the smokehouse. Not gradually, completely. One day, I was tending the smoker at 5 a.m., and the next, I was driving Margaret to her first chemotherapy appointment at 6. The restaurant was 30 miles and a lifetime away. Troy stepped in. He told me not to worry. Told Kristen to tell me not to worry. He'd handle operations, keep the staff in line, make sure the doors stayed open and the bills got paid. Focus on Margaret, he said, standing on the ranch house porch with his hands in his pockets. I've got this. I believed him. I was grateful. What else could I be? My wife was dying, and the man my daughter married was offering to carry the weight I couldn't hold anymore. 18 months. That's how long it took. 18 months of hospitals and home hospice. Of treatments that made her sick and treatments that didn't work. Of driving to Nashville for appointments and sitting in waiting rooms that smelled like floor cleaner and bad coffee. Of watching the strongest woman I'd ever known shrink inside her own body, her precise handwriting growing shaky, her sharp eyes going soft at the edges. She had lucid days. Days when she'd sit up in bed and ask me about the books. Have you checked the vendor invoices this month? She'd ask, and I'd tell her Troy was handling it, and something would cross her face. Not worry, not suspicion, something between the two. But she was too tired to push, and I was too broken to notice. She had confused days too. Days when she didn't know what month it was, or why I looked so old. Those were the days I sat in the truck in the driveway afterward and gripped the steering wheel until my hands ached because I couldn't cry in front of her, and I couldn't not cry at all. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, holding my hand. Her grip went from almost nothing to nothing at all. I buried her at Oakwood Cemetery on a Thursday. Kristen stood beside me. Troy stood behind Kristen. Miles, my 11-year-old grandson, held my hand through the surface with a grip stronger than his grandmother's had been at the end. After the funeral, the days ran together like wet mortar. Nothing set, nothing held shape. I stopped cooking, stopped eating regular meals. The garage filled with Margaret's boxes, her files, her books, her kitchen things, her personal papers, and I couldn't open them. Couldn't look at her handwriting. Couldn't touch the things she'd touched, because every object was a door back to a room where she was still alive. And I couldn't walk through those doors without falling apart. 4 months passed. November, December, January, February. I existed inside a gray space where nothing had edges and nothing mattered. Then Troy came to the ranch house. A Wednesday afternoon, February 2024. He pulled up in the driveway in a car I didn't recognize. A leased BMW, dark blue, sitting on the cracked concrete pad where Margaret used to park her 10-year-old Honda. He wore a navy polo and pressed chinos. His watch caught the winter light, not the Timex he'd worn when he married Kristen. Something heavier, something that cost more than I made in a month. He sat down at the kitchen table across from me. Set a stack of papers between us, each one flagged with a colored tab marking where to sign. Just operational stuff, Virgil, he said. Permits. Vendor renewals. Keeps the lights on while you heal. His voice had the careful tone of a man talking to someone fragile. Sympathetic tilt of the head. Concerned eyes. Kristen stood in the kitchen doorway behind him. She looked tired. She looked sorry. Dad, Just sign them, she said. Troy's been handling everything. You don't need to worry about the restaurant right now. Just rest. The papers sat on the table. Margaret's domain. Permits, filings, vendor contracts. These were the things she'd managed for 3 decades, the invisible architecture I'd trusted her to build and maintain. Looking at them made my chest hurt. Every page reminded me that she should have been the one reading them, explaining them to me in her patient schoolteacher voice. I picked up the pen Troy had set beside the stack. A nice pen, heavy, silver. I signed. Page after page. Troy turned them for me, pointed to the tabs, waited while I wrote my name. I didn't read the paragraphs above the signature lines. I didn't ask what operational transfer of management authority meant. I didn't ask why some pages had notary stamps and others didn't. Troy collected the pages, tapped them into a neat stack, and slid them into a leather portfolio I'd never seen before. "Thank you, Virgil," he said. "Get some rest. I'll take care of everything." He left. Kristen hugged me at the door, her arms thin and tentative. "It's going to be okay, Dad," she said. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late March, I drove to the smokehouse. It was the first time in months. Something had shifted. Not clarity, not purpose, just a dull pull toward the place I'd spent my life. I wanted to see the smoker, wanted to stand on the concrete I'd poured and feel something besides empty. I pulled into the parking lot, my parking lot. The concrete I'd leveled on my knees in 1996 had a new crack running through it, and Troy's BMW sat in the spot closest to the front door, the spot where Margaret used to park. I walked to the entrance and put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again. Same key I'd carried for 28 years. The brass was worn smooth from my pocket. It slid into the cylinder, but wouldn't rotate. New locks. I stepped back and looked up at the sign above the door. The sign that had read Stegman Smokehouse in hand-painted lettering since 1997. The sign I'd hung myself from a rented scaffold, while Margaret steadied the ladder below. My name was gone. In its place, a new logo. Sleek font. Muted colors. No apostrophe. No Stegmans. Just a brand mark I didn't recognize. Above a door I couldn't open. I knocked. A girl opened it. 22. Maybe younger. Black apron, earpiece, tablet in her hand. "Hi there," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" She didn't know me. She didn't know who I was. I'd built this building brick by brick, poured the floor she was standing on, hung the door she was holding open, and she was asking me if I had a reservation. I stood in the parking lot for a long time after she closed the door. I stood on my concrete, cracking under the weight of a car I didn't recognize, staring at a building I'd raised with my own hands that no longer bore my name. The March air was cold against my face and smelled like wet asphalt and old grease from the exhaust vents. Inside, I could hear voices, laughter, the clatter of plates and glasses. My restaurant, full of strangers. I understood then, not all at once, but in the way a man understands a structure he built, by feeling where the load had shifted, where the weight now pressed. Troy hadn't been keeping the lights on. He'd been changing the locks, and I'd handed him the tools. In my own kitchen, with my own signature, while my daughter stood in the doorway and told me to rest. I drove home with the useless key still in my hand, the brass warm against my palm. I set it on the workbench in the garage, beside Margaret's boxes. Then I sat in the dark and tried to remember the last thing she'd asked me. "Have you checked the vendor invoices this month?" I hadn't. I hadn't checked anything. The brass key sat on the workbench beside Margaret's boxes. I hadn't opened them, and now there was nothing left to check. The boxes arrived on a Tuesday in April, 2 weeks after I'd stood on my own concrete and been asked if I had a reservation. 3 cardboard cartons. No note, no phone call. Just a delivery driver in a brown truck who set them on my porch, checked his clipboard, and drove away. The return address was the smokehouse. I carried them into the garage, one at a time. My back protested on the second one, my knees on the third. I set them on the floor beside Margaret's boxes, the ones I still hadn't opened, and stood there looking at them. The first box held the hand-lettered chalkboard menu Margaret had written on opening day in 1993. She'd used a white paint pen and her schoolteacher cursive, listing every item we sold that first Saturday. Pulled pork 3, brisket plate 5, sweet tea 1. The chalkboard had hung by the entrance for 31 years. Margaret updated it every morning, erasing and rewriting the daily specials in lettering so precise you'd think she'd used a ruler. The second box held the framed photograph. Virgil and Margaret, opening day, standing in front of the smoker. I remembered the moment. Earl Cutler had taken it with a disposable camera. Margaret was squinting into the sun with the cigar box under her arm, and I had a stain on my apron from the first batch of pulled pork. We looked young. We looked like people who didn't know what they were starting. The third box held the wooden plaque. I didn't see it at first. It was packed face down, wedged between sheets of packing peanuts that clung to everything they touched. White foam stuck to the carved letters when I pulled it free. I brushed them off with my thumb, feeling the depth of each groove cut into the reclaimed barnwood, reading Margaret's words under the shop light. Built by hand, served with heart. She'd had it carved by a man in Lynchburg who worked with reclaimed barnwood. The letters were deep cut, filled with dark stain. Margaret had chosen the font. She'd measured the wall space. She'd hung it herself, standing on a step stool while I held her steady, because she said the dedication wall was hers to build. Someone had stuffed it in a box between packing peanuts and shipped it to my garage like surplus inventory. I held the plaque against my chest and sat down on the concrete floor. The barnwood was heavier than it looked. Dense, old-growth timber that held its weight the way good material does. The motor oil smell mixed with cedar for Margaret's boxes. The overhead tube buzzed. My back pressed against the workbench leg, and I held that piece of barnwood the way you hold something that belongs to someone who can't hold it anymore. The lockout had been a business maneuver. The new sign was vanity. But this, boxing up the dedication wall, stripping Margaret's name from the entrance, erasing the evidence that she'd ever stood in that building, this was something else. I sat on that floor for a long time. Over the months that followed, I learned the full scope of what Troy had done to the smokehouse. Not all at once. In pieces, the way you hear about a house fire. First the smoke, then the structure, then the things inside you can't replace. Darlene Hooks told me about the firings. Darlene was the smokehouse's head cook, 58 years old, and she'd worked alongside me and Margaret since year 3. Short, thick-armed, built by 30 years of lifting cast iron. Hands that could break down a whole brisket in 4 minutes flat. She didn't smile when things were good. She didn't cry when things were bad. She worked. That was her language. Troy fired 3 long-tenured employees in the same week in May. Billy Crawford, who'd run the dish station for 15 years. Maria Espinoza, who'd managed prep for 12. And James Beckett, who'd been my second pitman since 2006. Just clean them out, Darlene told me over the phone, her voice flat. Brought in kids who don't know the difference between a brisket flat and a packer. Billy was crying in the parking lot. 15 years, Virgil. He didn't even get a handshake. Troy told Kristen that Billy was resistant to operational improvements. What Billy had actually resisted was Troy's suggestion to run the dishwasher on a shorter cycle to save water, which would have left grease on every plate in the house. Billy knew that because he'd been washing those plates since before Troy knew what a plate cost. Darlene survived. Not because Troy respected her, because he couldn't replace her. The kitchen ran on Darlene's knowledge. 30 years of timing, temperature control, and recipe memory stored in her head and her handwritten cards. Troy knew that removing Darlene would shut down production for weeks while a new cook learned the system. So he kept her and made sure she understood the terms. He called my brisket rub a legacy item, Darlene said. I waited. Said it needs optimization for the new brand. Stood there in his polo shirt, telling me how to season meat. Her voice tightened. I've been making that rub since before he could drive. Darlene started noticing other things. Invoices from Troy's new suppliers that didn't add up. Deliveries that weighed less than what the paperwork claimed. Pallet of hickory logs billed at twice the rate Earl Cutler's son charged for the same wood. She didn't know what it meant. Darlene could break down a hog, but she'd never read a balance sheet. She just knew the numbers were wrong, the way she knew when a cut of meat was off. You couldn't explain it. You'd been around it long enough to feel it. One evening after Troy left for the day, Darlene stood at the office copier feeding invoices through the machine, glancing toward the hallway with each page. She took them home and filed them in the same cabinet where she kept the original vendor contract she'd copied years ago, back when Margaret was still alive and the suppliers were people Margaret and I had chosen. She didn't tell me about it. Not yet. She was gathering, the way a woman who's cooked for 30 years gathers ingredients before she knows what she's making. The visits with Miles got harder. My grandson, Miles Vandermeer, was 11. He had Margaret's eyes. Dark brown, watchful, quick to read a room. He'd learned to tend the smoker when he was 8, standing on an overturned milk crate to reach the firebox handle, his small hands wrapped in work gloves Margaret had cut down to fit. He could tell the difference between white smoke and blue smoke before he could tell the difference between multiplication and division. I'd been seeing Miles every other Saturday since Margaret's funeral. Kristen would drop him off at the ranch house in the morning, and we'd spend the day together, sometimes at the house, sometimes driving out to the lake, sometimes just sitting on the porch talking about whatever an 11-year-old boy talks about. Insects. Basketball. Whether a hot dog counted as a sandwich. In June, the cancellations started. Soccer tournament. Birthday party. School project. Doctor's appointment. Each one arrived by text from Kristen, apologetic and thin. I didn't question the first 3. Life with a kid that age was full of schedule conflicts. But by August, I'd seen Miles twice in 3 months. The isolation deepened in those weeks between August and September. I'd sit on the porch on Saturday mornings, out of habit, waiting for a truck that didn't come, then go back into the garage and close the door. I called Kristen. "He's just busy, Dad," she said. "He's got a full schedule this summer." He had a full schedule last summer, too. I still saw him every 2 weeks. Troy thinks it's better if Miles has some structure right now. Consistency. I've been consistent for 11 years. Pause. I heard Troy's voice in the background, too low to make out the words. "Dad, I don't want to argue about this. Miles is fine. He's happy. Troy's just trying to what?" Another pause. Longer. "Protect him," she said, "from seeing you like this." Like this. She meant the grief. The weight I'd lost. The fact that I spent my evenings in a garage surrounded by boxes I couldn't open. Troy had convinced her that I was fragile, that seeing me in this state would damage Miles. And Kristen, who loved her father but loved her son more, had accepted the argument because it came wrapped in concern. Troy wasn't protecting Miles. He was removing me from the boy's life, one canceled Saturday at a time, the same way he'd removed my name from the sign. Gradual, clean, administrative. In September, I drove to the smokehouse on a Saturday without calling ahead. I parked the truck across the street and walked around to the back entrance, the one that opened onto the kitchen hallway. The front door had new locks. The staff door didn't. It was propped open with a rubber wedge, Same wedge I'd used for 20 years to ventilate the kitchen in summer. Miles stood at the prep counter beside Darlene, wearing an apron that hung past his knees, slicing cucumbers with the careful concentration of a boy who'd been taught to respect a blade. His face, when he saw me, I can't describe it without understating it. He dropped the knife on the cutting board and ran. "Grandpa!" He hit my waist at full speed, arms wrapping around me, his head against my chest. I put my hand on the back of his neck and held him there. "Hey, buddy. Where have you been? Mom said you were busy." "I'm not busy. I'm right here." Troy appeared in the kitchen doorway within 30 seconds. He'd been in the dining room. I could see the Edison bulbs glowing behind him, the minimalist furniture, the cocktail menu printed on heavy cardstock, propped on every table where sweet tea pitchers used to sit. He wore a gray polo and chinos. His watch, the Tag Heuer Monaco, caught the overhead light. He wore a different watch every day of the week. I'd counted 7. "Miles, go help Darlene finish up," Troy said. His voice was casual. His eyes were not. Miles looked at me. I nodded. He went back to the counter, picking up the knife, looking over his shoulder twice. Troy put his hand on my arm and steered me into the hallway. His grip was soft. No calluses, no pressure, a hand that had never lifted anything heavier than a portfolio. "You can't just show up here, Virgil. It's my restaurant. It was your restaurant. And dropping in like this, it confuses the boy. He needs stability, not nostalgia." He paused, and something mean came through his voice. "The boy needs to see what success looks like, not what giving up looks like." I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. The smirk he wore like a uniform. The pale blue eyes that measured everything in terms of leverage. I didn't speak. I let the silence sit between us until he removed his hand. "Go home, Virgil," he said. "I'll have Kristen call you about scheduling something appropriate." I walked past him, through the dining room, past the tables I didn't recognize, and the chairs I'd never bought, and the cocktail menu that replaced 30 years of sweet tea. The dedication wall space was bare, except for Troy's branded signage, a stylized logo in muted gray. No apostrophe, no heart, no history. I pushed through the front door and stood in the parking lot. Troy's BMW sat in Margaret's spot. October, November. The days shortened. The garage got cold. I spent my evenings at the workbench under the fluorescent light, surrounded by Margaret's boxes and stacks of Civil War books I'd been collecting for 30 years. I read about supply line disruption, about strategic patience, about choosing the moment of maximum impact rather than reacting to every provocation. Sherman didn't burn Atlanta because he was angry. He burned it because the railroad junction made it the enemy's lifeline. Identify the critical node. Cut it. Let the structure collapse under its own weight. Troy called a family dinner on a Tuesday in early November. Kristen hosted at their house, a split level on the edge of town. Troy had redecorated with the same minimalist taste he'd imposed on the smokehouse. White walls, gray furniture, nothing on the counters. Miles sat beside me. He'd grown since September, almost 12 now. His hair was longer. He kept glancing at me like he was afraid I'd disappear. Troy held court from the head of the table. He'd had a good quarter. He wanted everyone to know. 300,000, he said, cutting his steak with precise, measured strokes. In a single quarter. From a barbecue restaurant. You know what my father made his best year selling Chevrolets in Nashville? 62,000. I made that in a month. He looked around the table for reactions. Christine smiled, tight and practiced. Miles pushed his food around his plate. I ate the portion Kristen had served me, smaller than Troy's, smaller than her own, the kind of portion you give someone whose appetite you've stopped thinking about. Her eyes caught mine as she set the plate down. She looked away first. The problem with this industry, Troy continued, is dead weight. People who can't adapt. You either scale or you stagnate. His eyes found mine on the word dead weight, held there, not at the table, at me. Kristen's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down, without eating. She didn't correct him. I finished my plate, set my napkin on the table, thanked Kristen for dinner. I was pulling on my jacket by the front door when I noticed Troy adjusting his watch. The Omega Seamaster. Tuesday's watch. His fingers worked the clasp, tightening it, loosening it, tightening it again. An unconscious movement, repeated and small. He'd done it at the table too, right before the $300,000 figure. I filed it away, drove home. 2 weeks later, Troy called me about the smoker. Not to ask, to inform. The way you inform someone, their street is getting repaved. A decision already made, communicated as courtesy. We're pulling it out after Thanksgiving, he said. Commercial kitchen expansion. Stainless steel gas units. Faster throughput, better consistency, half the labor. I stood in my garage holding the phone against my ear. Margaret's boxes lined the wall behind me. The wooden plaque leaned against the workbench where I'd set it 7 months ago. That smoker is the restaurant, I said. It's an eyesore, Virgil. We're a brand now. Brands scale. I built that smoker from salvage in 1993, and it's 2024. Things change. A demolition crew is coming the first week of December. I'm giving you the chance to say goodbye, if that's something you need. He hung up. I set the phone on the workbench and sat on the stool. 800 pounds of steel I'd cut and welded myself from decommissioned oil drums. The firebox door I'd shaped from a 1/4-inch plate. The cooking chamber I'd insulated with a clay and sand mixture I'd read about in a book on traditional pit construction. 31 years of seasoning, hickory, pecan, cherry, oak, baked into the metal until the surface was black as cast iron and twice as smooth. I could run my hand across that steel with my eyes closed and feel 30 years of fire in the grain. Troy was going to tear it apart with a demolition crew and replace it with stainless steel boxes that ran on propane. I sat at the workbench for a long time after that call. The fluorescent tube hummed. Margaret's boxes waited along the wall. The Civil War books stacked beside my elbow. Shelby Foote, Bruce Catton, McPherson. Pages I'd read 100 times about men who chose the wrong moment and men who chose the right one. Margaret's voice came to me. Not a memory of a specific conversation. Deeper than that. The way her voice lived in the walls of this house, in the grain of the workbench she'd picked out at a lumber yard in 1996, in the air of a garage where her boxes sat unopened, because opening them meant admitting she was gone. Patience means you're building something. Waiting means you've already given up. I've been waiting for 18 months. Sitting in this garage, surrounded by her boxes, reading about other men's battles while my own restaurant was gutted room by room, and my grandson was pulled away from me Saturday by Saturday. I'd been calling it grief. It was surrender. Margaret would have told me that. She would have stood in this garage, arms crossed, and said it to my face in her schoolteacher voice, the one that didn't leave room for argument. I looked at the boxes along the wall. 18 months of avoidance. 18 months of telling myself I'd open them when I was ready, when the grief had passed, when I felt strong enough. The grief hadn't passed. I wasn't strong enough, but Margaret hadn't built a 30-year business by waiting until she felt ready. She'd built it by starting before she was. I straightened on the stool. My back protested. Knees too. The fluorescent tube buzzed overhead. The same flat white light that had lit this workbench since the day I wired it myself. I reached for the nearest box. Margaret's. I drove to the smokehouse on Saturday morning with one purpose. Talk to Troy about the smoker. One conversation, calm, reasonable. The December sun sat low and white above the tree line, throwing long shadows across Route 11. I turned into the parking lot at 8:15 and saw the crew before I saw anything else. 3 men in Carhartt jackets and steel-toed boots, standing on the back patio with tape measures stretched between their hands. One of them held a can of marking chalk, drawing orange lines on the concrete around the base of the smoker. Another had a clipboard and was writing measurements. The third was on his phone, probably calling in equipment specs. Troy stood 10 feet from the smoker with his own clipboard, gesturing at the patio space with a pen. Designer polo, pressed chinos, the Tag Heuer Monaco catching the morning light every time he moved his wrist. He looked like a man supervising a renovation, not a demolition. The difference mattered only to me. I parked the truck and killed the engine. Sat there for a moment, looking at the scene through the windshield. The smoker sat under its corrugated tin roof, the way it had for 31 years, 800 pounds of salvaged steel and seasoned metal, black as cast iron from 3 decades of fire. The morning light caught the curved surface of the oil drum body and held there, warm against the dark metal. I could smell the smoke from the parking lot. Hickory and pecan, baked so deep into the steel that the smell would outlast the structure itself. I got out of the truck. That's when I saw Miles. My grandson stood at the kitchen door, one hand on the frame, his body half inside and half out. He wore the oversized apron Darlene had tied on him, the hem dragging past his knees. His face was wet. Not the kind of wet that comes from rubbing your eyes. The kind that comes from standing still and letting it happen because you don't know what else to do. 11 years old. Watching 3 strangers measure the thing his grandfather had taught him to tend. He saw me cross the parking lot and broke from the doorway like a dog that's been told to stay, but can't hold it anymore. His sneakers slapped the patio concrete. He hit me at the waist, arms wrapping around, his face pressed into my flannel. "Grandpa, they're gonna break your smoker." I put my hand on the back of his head. His hair was damp. He was shaking. Troy covered the distance in 4 strides. He caught Miles by the shoulder and pulled him back. Not hard, not gentle. The way you move a piece of furniture that's in your path. "Go help in the kitchen, buddy," Troy said. Miles looked up at me. I nodded. "Grandpa's just visiting," Troy added. He said it while looking at me. The word visiting landed the way he intended it. A claim, a boundary, a door closed in my face using my grandson as the handle. Miles went back inside. He looked over his shoulder twice. I walked past the crew to the smoker, put my hand on the cooking chamber. The steel was cold, no fire in the firebox, no heat radiating through the metal. First time I could remember touching this surface and feeling nothing but temperature. Troy followed. The crew stepped back, reading the situation the way working men do. "We need to talk about this," I said. "There's nothing to talk about. This smoker is the smokehouse. Troy, it's the founding piece. Every customer who's eaten here in 30 years ate food that came off this grate. And in January, they'll eat food that comes off commercial grates that produce twice the output in half the time." I kept my hand on the steel. "I'm not asking you to keep it because of me. I'm asking because of what this place was built on. This is what people come here for. The taste, the tradition, the craft that goes into cooking on seasoned steel instead of stainless. People come here because I tripled the marketing budget and built a social media presence. People came here before you had a marketing budget." Troy's jaw shifted. The clipboard lowered to his side. His free hand went to his wrist, adjusting the watch band, tightening, loosening, tightening. "Virgil." His voice dropped. The business podcast cadence disappeared. What replaced it was flatter, harder, stripped of performance. "Listen to me. You signed the papers. This is my restaurant now. My name, my brand, my decisions." He stepped closer. Close enough that I could see the pores in his skin. Close enough that the crew couldn't hear. You want to stand out here and cry over a pile of scrap metal? Go ahead. But when the crew comes Monday, that thing is gone. His eyes held mine, pale blue, the color of shallow water over sand, clear and empty. And if you show up again without an invitation, I'll have you removed. Try me. I looked at him. At the soft hand gripping the clipboard, at the manicured nails, the unstained fingers, the wrist rotating inside the watchband he couldn't stop adjusting. Then I looked at the smoker. At the firebox door I'd cut from quarter-inch plate in a rented garage. At the cooking chamber I'd insulated with clay and sand I'd mixed by hand. At 31 years of seasoning layered into the grain of the metal-like growth rings in old timber, something shifted. Not anger. I'd been angry for months. This was different. Colder. Clearer. The way a structure looks when you strip the drywall and see the framing underneath. Same building. But now you can see where the load bears and where the joints are weak. Troy's position wasn't strong. It had never been strong. It was loud. There's a difference. The loudest gun on a battlefield is the one with the least ammunition. I took my hand off the smoker. I didn't say a word. I turned and walked across the parking lot. The concrete I'd poured on my knees in 1996 now cracked under the weight of Troy's leased BMW and climbed into my truck. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and my jaw shut. The garage was cold when I opened the door. December air had seeped through the gaps in the framing, gaps I'd been meaning to seal for 3 winters. The fluorescent tube clicked on after a second's hesitation, filling the space with flat white light. Margaret's boxes lined the wall. 16 of them, labeled in her handwriting with a black marker. Books, kitchen, personal papers, files, 2018-2022, photo albums, bedroom, top drawer, kitchen, recipes, 18 months, 16 boxes. I'd stacked them against the wall in April and hadn't touched them since, because every label was her handwriting and every box was a door I couldn't walk through. I stood in the garage for 10 minutes before I touched the first one. I pulled the nearest box off the stack. Books, heavier than I expected. I set it on the workbench and cut the tape with a utility knife. Her books. The ones that had lived on the nightstand, rotated weekly. Southern Fiction and Tax Code, Margaret's 2 Religions. A Janet Burroway paperback with a cracked spine. A highlighted copy of the Tennessee Tax Manual from 2019. A water-stained copy of To Kill a Mockingbird she'd kept since high school. The pages soft as cloth. I set each book on the bench, running my thumb across the spines. Second box. Personal papers. File folders organized with divider tabs, color-coded in Margaret's system. Blue for medical, green for insurance, yellow for legal, red for urgent. Most of the folders were thin. The red one was empty. She'd taken whatever was in it before she packed the box. Or put it somewhere else. Third box. Files. 2018-2022. Bank statements, utility records, property tax assessments. The administrative architecture of a shared life, organized with the precision of a woman who'd spent 30 years tracking every dollar through a business and a household. I spread the folders across the workbench, scanning dates and headings. Fourth box. Photo albums. I opened the lid and closed it again. Not yet. Fifth box. Kitchen. Wooden spoons wrapped in newspaper. A cast-iron trivet she'd bought at a flea market in 2004. A set of measuring cups, copper, tarnished at the handles. The tools of her other craft. The one that fed people instead of counting money. Sixth box. Bedroom. Top drawer. I set it aside. What Margaret kept in her top drawer. Her reading glasses, her rosary, the envelope of photographs from our wedding. I would open when I could. Seventh box. Kitchen. Recipes. The box was lighter than the others. I set it on the workbench and cut the tape. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel Margaret had embroidered with a rooster pattern 20 years ago, was the leather-bound recipe ledger. I knew it by feel before I unwrapped it. The cracked spine, the heft of a book that had been opened 1,000 times. Grease stains on the cover. Hickory fat. Vinegar. Tomato. Soaked into the leather over 3 decades until the surface was mottled and dark. I sat down on the stool. Set the ledger on the workbench under the fluorescent light. Opened the cover. Margaret's handwriting filled the first page. Her schoolteacher cursive, upright and precise, each letter formed with the same care she gave to everything. The ink was ballpoint blue, faded in places from age and kitchen steam. Pulled pork rub, original 1993, brown sugar, paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, black pepper, cayenne. The ratios were listed in her exact measurements. Not teaspoons and tablespoons, but weights. Because Margaret said volume measurements were guesswork, and weight was truth. This was the first recipe. The one we served from the horse trailer on that Saturday in April. I remembered mixing it on the trailer's fold-down counter, while Margaret brewed sweet tea in a 5-gallon cooler, and Earl Cutler sat across the road in his feed store, watching us with the expression of a man who gave us 6 months. I turned the page. Brisket rub. Weekday. Brisket rub. Competition. Brisket rub. December. Extra black pepper for cold weather appetite. She'd organized by cut, then by season, then by occasion. Each recipe annotated in the margins with adjustments. Reduce cayenne, 1/4 for children's plates, and add smoked salt if humidity above 70%. The kind of knowledge that lived in a cook's hands and a bookkeeper's head. I could hear her voice in the margins. Not a memory of a specific moment. The way she sounded when she stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, reading a recipe aloud to herself before writing it down, testing each word the way she tested a measurement. Coleslaw dressing. 3 versions. Vinegar-based for pork. Creamy for brisket plates. Sweet for the church picnic. Orders Margaret handled every June. I read through the pages the way you walk through a house you used to live in. Each recipe was a room. Each annotation was a piece of furniture in that room. Placed by her hands, worn smooth by years of use. Pie crust, 4 variations. Buttermilk biscuits, cornbread, regular and jalapeno. Baked beans with burnt ends. Margaret's signature peach cobbler, the recipe she guarded from every church lady who asked for it, always smiling and saying, "I'll write it down for you sometime," and never doing it. I turned past the main sections. Past the sides, past the desserts, the holiday specials, Thanksgiving turkey brine, a wet cure she'd developed in 2001 after we added a Thanksgiving catering menu. Christmas ham glaze, brown sugar, Dijon, clove, bourbon. 4th of July ribs. A dry rub with coffee grounds and cocoa powder that made grown men close their eyes when they bit into it. 30 years of seasons, measured in spice and heat, and the changing appetite of a community that grew up eating at our tables. I turned past the last holiday page. The next page should have been blank. It wasn't. The handwriting changed. Same pen, same blue ink. But the letters were smaller. Compressed. The flowing cursive of the recipe pages. Relaxed, practiced, written by a woman standing at a counter with a cup of coffee, was gone. In its place, letters pressed hard into the paper, each one formed with the kind of control that comes from writing something important while running out of time. A notarized document filled the page. Legal language in Margaret's hand, copied or drafted with the help of someone who understood contract law. The witness line, signed by a name I didn't recognize. A notary stamp dated April 2023. 6 months before she died. I read it twice. An ownership reversion clause. Operational control of Stegman's smokehouse reverts to the sole authority of Virgil Ray Stegman upon documented evidence of financial mismanagement, fraud, or breach of fiduciary duty by any party holding delegated operational authority. Independent of the transfer papers, notarized separately, filed nowhere except between the Christmas ham glaze and a blank page in a recipe book no one but Margaret would ever read. She'd built a legal failsafe and hidden it in the one place Troy would never look. I turned the page. Vendor names. 6 of them. 3 circled in red ink. Beside each circled name, dollar amounts. $47,000, $83,000, $112,000. None of them matched any supplier I'd ever contracted with in 30 years of running the smokehouse. I knew every meat distributor, every wood supplier, every dry goods vendor between Nashville and Memphis. These names were strangers. Below the vendor list, in Margaret's tight, urgent hand, Troy is routing payments through 3 shell companies. The numbers are here. Finish what I started. I sat on the stool with the ledger open in front of me. Outside, the December sky had gone dark. The field beyond the driveway was silent, just the wind moving through dead grass. My hands were still, not gripping, not clenched, not shaking the way they'd been shaking for 18 months. Every time I thought about the restaurant, about Troy, about the signature I'd given away like spare change. Just still. Resting on the ledger's open pages, 1 palm on the vendor names, 1 on the reversion clause. She'd known. While the cancer was eating through her pancreas, while I drove her to chemo appointments in Nashville and sat in waiting rooms that smelled like floor cleaner, while she lay in the hospice bed at home and asked me if I'd checked the vendor invoices. She'd seen the numbers. She'd traced the pattern. And she'd done what Margaret Stegman always did. She built something I couldn't see to protect everything I could touch. The ledger sat on the workbench between the coleslaw recipe and the pie crust. And inside it was a weapon built from legal language and red ink, and the controlled precision of a woman who knew she was dying and refused to let that be the end of it. I closed the ledger, held it against my chest. The leather was cold against my flannel, the cracked spine pressing into my forearms. It smelled like hickory fat and old paper. It weighed less than 5 pounds. I set the ledger down and reached for my phone on the workbench. Scrolled through contacts I hadn't touched in years, past names that meant nothing now, and names that meant too much. Found the one I was looking for. Beau Guidry, Baton Rouge. A retired IRS forensic accountant who'd spent 22 years in criminal investigation, tracking money that didn't want to be found. Margaret had helped his daughter get a college scholarship 15 years ago through the church group they both attended. And Beau had been trying to repay that debt ever since. He sent flowers to her funeral. I hadn't called to thank him. I pressed the number. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. I stood at the workbench with the ledger under my free hand, my thumb resting on the cracked leather spine. Virgil. Beau's voice was gravel and bayou, deep and unhurried. Been a while. I found something, I said. Margaret left it. A pause. What kind of something? I opened the ledger to the vendor page. Read the 3 circled names aloud. Read the dollar amounts. Read the line at the bottom. The phone went quiet. 10 seconds. 15. I'll be there Thursday, Beau said. Don't touch anything else. And Virgil, don't let your son-in-law know you found it. I hung up. Set the phone down beside the ledger. Sat in the garage with the fluorescent light buzzing and Margaret's boxes open around me like a life unpacked. She'd left me the recipes to remember her by. And between the recipes, she'd left me everything I needed to finish what she started. Beau Guidry arrived on Thursday, driving a 10-year-old Chevy Tahoe with Louisiana plates. I watched him from my truck across the Comfort Lodge parking lot off exit 37. He climbed out slow, a heavy-set man in khakis and a wrinkled button-down, reading glasses hanging from a lanyard around his neck. He carried a canvas messenger bag over one shoulder and a banker's box under his arm. The truck was old but solid, the kind of vehicle a man buys because it runs, not because it impresses. Troy would have called it an eyesore. Beau would have called it paid off. He saw me crossing the lot and set the banker's box on the hood of his truck. "You look better than I expected," he said. "I found something to do." He nodded. That was enough. He didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't offer condolences, didn't treat me like a man made of glass. He picked up the box and tilted his head toward the motel entrance. Room 114, ground floor. I asked for 2 beds. "What's the second bed for?" "Paperwork." Room 114 had 2 queen beds with synthetic spreads, a desk with a lamp that buzzed when you turned it on, and not a single thing in it that cost more than Troy's watch band. Beau set his bag on the desk chair and the banker's box on the bed closest to the bathroom. Then he turned to me and held out his hand. The ledger. I'd carried it in a paper grocery bag, wrapped in the same dish towel Margaret had embroidered with the rooster pattern. I set it on the desk. Beau unwrapped it the way I'd seen him handle his fishing reels, precise fingers, no wasted motion. He opened the cover and stood over it for a full minute without speaking, reading Margaret's cursive through his reading glasses, his lips moving on some of the words. "She dated every entry," he said. "She dated everything." "Good." He pulled a compact digital camera from his bag. "I'm going to photograph every page, front and back. Then we compare her flagged vendors against Secretary of State filings." He started at page 1, the pulled pork rub. He photographed the recipe, turned the page, photographed the brisket rub. Every page, every grease stain, every margin note. He handled the ledger the way you handle evidence at a crime scene. Don't touch what you don't need to touch. Document everything before you move anything. "Margaret was the sharpest bookkeeper I ever met outside the service," he said without looking up. Most people who spot vendor fraud see one number that looks wrong and call their accountant. She saw the pattern. She mapped the connections. She went to a notary. He shook his head. "She did all that while dying." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Beau reached the final pages, the vendor names, the dollar amounts, the reversion clause. He photographed each one 3 times from different angles, checking focus on the camera's screen between shots. Then he set the camera down and pulled a laptop from his bag. "These 3 names," she circled. He pointed at the ledger without touching the page. "Volunteer Ridge Supply, Hickory Creek Provisions, Smoky Bend Distributors. I've never heard of any of them." "You wouldn't have. They don't exist." He opened the laptop and connected to the motel's Wi-Fi. Within 20 minutes, he had the Tennessee Secretary of State's business filing database on the screen, plus equivalent databases for Kentucky and Georgia. Volunteer Ridge Supply, registered in Kentucky, July 2022. He pulled up the filing. Single Member LLC. Registered agent is a corporate service company in Louisville. No real person attached. He looked at me. "Nobody hides behind a corporate agent unless they've got something to hide." He typed another name. Hickory Creek Provisions, Georgia, August 2022. Same pattern. Corporate agent. No physical address beyond a mail drop. Third search. Smoky Bend Distributors, Tennessee, but registered in a different county from where the smokehouse operates. September 2022. 3 shell companies. 3 neighboring states. All created within 90 days of each other, starting 4 months after Margaret's diagnosis and 2 months after I'd stepped back from the restaurant. "He set this up while she was in chemo," I said. Beau looked at me over his reading glasses. "Yeah, He did. He muttered something under his breath. Cajun French. I didn't catch the words, but I caught the tone. The tone of a man who'd spent 22 years tracking dirty money and still hadn't lost the capacity to be disgusted by it. I called Darlene that evening from the motel parking lot. She answered on the first ring. "I need your help," I said. "I've been waiting for you to say that." I told her what Bo had found, the shell companies, the vendor names that matched invoices she'd been copying for months. I told her I needed 3 things: Troy's daily schedule at the smokehouse, the days his office door was unlocked, and every original vendor contract she'd copied and filed at home. "His office is open Tuesdays and Thursdays when he goes to his gym in Nashville," she said. "Leaves around 10, back by 2. Sometimes later if he takes lunch." "How long has he been doing that?" "Since March, like clockwork." "And the contracts?" "I've got 12 of them. Originals that Margaret and I signed with real suppliers back when the business ran right. I can bring them tomorrow." "Bring them to your house." "Not the smokehouse." "I know." She paused. I heard her kitchen faucet running. "Virgil, is this going to work?" "Margaret built us a road. We just have to walk it." Darlene's kitchen sat 10 miles from the smokehouse, in a neighborhood of small brick homes with chain-link fences and concrete driveways. Her table occupied the center of the room, round, oak, scarred from 30 years of cutting boards and hot pans set directly on the surface without trivets. She'd cleared it before we arrived. Her refrigerator hummed in the corner. The coffee pot had been on since before dawn. Bo spread the original vendor contracts across one half of the table. Darlene's copied invoices from Troy's suppliers covered the other half. The 2 sets of documents sat side by side, like before and after photographs of the same building. One solid, one gutted. "This is the contract Margaret and I signed with Henley Meats in 2003, Darlene said, tapping the left side. She stood with her arms crossed, the same posture she'd held when she told me about the firings. $12 a pound for choice brisket, volume discount above 500 pounds per month. Bo picked up an invoice from the right side. "And this is what Troy's volunteer ridge supply is billing the smokehouse for the same grade of brisket. $41 a pound." I looked at the numbers. You didn't need forensic training to see it. $12 versus 41. Same product. Same quantities. 3.5 times the real price. Bo went through each original contract against its shell company replacement. Hickory logs from Earl Cutler's son, 8 cents a pound through the old supplier. 29 cents a pound through Hickory Creek Provisions. Dry goods, flour, sugar, spices, marked up 200% through Smoky Bend distributors. Darlene poured coffee from a pot that smelled like Maxwell House and the cedar shelf cleaner she used on her cabinets. She set a cup at Bo's elbow without being asked. "I knew the numbers were wrong," Darlene said. She picked up a case receipt and held it between her thick fingers, the same fingers that could break down a whole brisket in 4 minutes flat. The pallets were lighter. I'd lift a case of ribs that was supposed to weigh 60 pounds, and it felt like 40. But I couldn't prove it. "You kept the records," Bo said, not looking up from the invoices. "That's better than proving it. You preserved the evidence." Darlene didn't respond. She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter. Over the next 3 days, Friday through Sunday, Bo turned that motel room into an operations center. Both queen beds disappeared under layers of documents. Bank statements on the left bed, vendor invoices on the right. He taped a timeline to the bathroom mirror, each date marked with a colored sticky note. Yellow for shell company filings, red for suspicious invoices, blue for lifestyle purchases he could trace. The heater ran broken on its highest setting. Fast food wrappers accumulated on the desk beside his cold coffee. The room smelled of old carpet and fresh paper. I drove between the motel and Darlene's house, carrying documents in the paper grocery bag, parking 2 blocks from the smokehouse when I passed it. Troy's BMW sat in Margaret's spot. The smoker sat cold and dark under the corrugated tin roof. Nobody was cooking on it. I kept driving. Tuesday afternoon, Beau called me to the motel. "Sit down," he said. I sat on the corner of the bed that wasn't covered in paper. Beau turned the laptop toward me. A spreadsheet filled the screen, columns of numbers arranged with the same precision Margaret used in her recipe ledger. "Here's the full picture." He pushed his reading glasses up with his thumb. 3 Shell LLCS. All single member. All registered to corporate agent services. Not a person, not an address you can walk up to. Each company invoices the smokehouse monthly for goods that either never arrive or arrive from legitimate wholesalers at a quarter of the billed price. He pointed at a row of numbers highlighted in red. Volunteer Ridge Supply billed the smokehouse $127,000 last quarter for meat. I checked wholesale market rates for the same cuts in the same quantities. Actual cost, $31,000. The difference, $96,000, gets wired to a bank account under Troy's sole control. He scrolled down. Same pattern with Hickory Creek. Same with Smoky Bend. Add them up across all 3 Shell vendors, and you're looking at roughly $300,000 siphoned out of the smokehouse every quarter. 300,000. The same number Troy had bragged about at Kristen's dinner table. Cutting his steak with those measured strokes, looking around for reactions. His best quarter. Not earned. Stolen. "That's $1.2 million, I said. "In the last year alone, give or take. The early invoices were smaller. He ramped up once he saw nobody was watching." Beau leaned back in the desk chair. The springs groaned. "And here's where it gets personal." He clicked to a new tab. Bank account statements. Troy's name on every page. The Tag Heuer Monaco. Beau pointed at a transaction dated March 2023. $6,400. Paid from the same account that receives wire transfers from Volunteer Ridge Supply. Another transaction. Omega Seamaster. $5,200. Same account. Another. Tudor Black Bay. $3,800. He scrolled through 4 more purchases. 7 watches. 7 transactions. All traced to money that flowed from the smokehouse to shell companies to Troy's personal account. The watch he adjusted when he lied. The watch he wore at the family dinner. The watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist on my patio, standing next to my smoker, telling me it was scrap metal. "The BMW lease," Beau continued. "Monthly payments come from a second account, linked to Hickory Creek Provisions. His gym membership, restaurant tabs in Nashville, 3 designer clothing purchases in October alone. Every dollar Troy spent on his manufactured life. The watches he rotated like costumes. The car parked on my concrete, the image of success he projected at family dinners. All of it was money from 30 years of brisket and sweet tea and 4 a.m. mornings. My money, Margaret's money. Margaret found this," I said. "She found the vendor discrepancies." Beau removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "She didn't have access to his bank accounts, so she couldn't trace where the money went after it left the smokehouse. But she mapped the incoming side, the inflated invoices, the vendor names that didn't match any regional supplier directories, the delivery quantities that didn't match the bills. She got as far as she could get with what she had access to. While she was in treatment." Beau nodded. "While she was in treatment. The motel room was quiet, except for the heater cycling under the window. Beau's coffee had gone cold hours ago. Now." Beau reached across the desk and picked up the photograph of Margaret's reversion clause, the notarized page from the ledger. "Let's talk about what your wife built." He set the photograph beside the laptop. "This reversion clause was drafted, witnessed, and notarized on April 12, 2023, 6 months before she passed. It states that operational control of the smokehouse reverts to your sole authority upon documented evidence of financial mismanagement or fraud. And the papers Troy had me sign. Those papers transferred day-to-day operational authority, management decisions, vendor contracts, staffing. Troy can run the restaurant. What those papers did not do, what they could not do, is transfer property ownership." Bo pulled a folder from the banker's box and opened it on the bed. Inside was a photocopy of a document I'd seen once, years ago, when Margaret sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that she was setting up something called a trust. "The Stegman Family Trust," Bo said. "Margaret established this in 2011 with an attorney in Nashville. It governs ownership of the smokehouse property, the building, the land, the parking lot, and the family home. Both properties are held in trust, not in your personal name. The trust has specific provisions about transfer of ownership that require both trustees' signatures or, in the event of death, specific triggering conditions." He looked at me over the edge of the folder. "Troy's papers never penetrated the trust. He controls operations. He signs checks. He hires and fires. But the building, the land, everything physical, that still belongs to you. Property ownership never transferred." I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands on my knees. The fluorescent light in the bathroom cast a bar of white across the carpet. Bo's timeline of colored sticky notes stretched across the mirror behind him. "She told me about the trust," I said. I signed the papers she put in front of me. Didn't read them the way I should have. Same thing I did with Troy. Difference is, Margaret was protecting you. Troy was robbing you. Bo set the folder down. "Your wife was a forensic accountant who cooked brisket, Virgil. She built you a legal bunker and hid the key between the coleslaw and the pie crust." I looked at the photograph of the reversion clause, Margaret's handwriting, the notary stamp, the date, April 12, 2023. She'd been in treatment for a year by then. Losing weight, losing strength, but not losing focus. Sherman would have recognized the approach. So would Margaret. Bo spent 2 more days assembling the binder. He worked at the motel desk, with the door propped open for air, the heater still broken on its highest setting. He organized the evidence, the way he'd been trained at the IRS. Every document tabbed, indexed, annotated, with a typed summary explaining what it showed and how it connected to the next piece. Shell company registrations in Section A. Bank statements in Section B. Fraudulent invoices cross-referenced with Darlene's original contracts in Section C. Margaret's annotated notes and the reversion clause in Section D. Lifestyle spending traces, the watches, the BMW, the gym in Section E. White, unmarked on the spine, heavy enough that the desk sagged when he set it down. He built it the way I lay brick, course by course, each piece set square and level before the next one went on top. "That's a case," he said. "What happens now?" Bo picked up his phone. "I know a detective with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Financial crimes. Name's Anita Salazar. She's been building a regional case on shell company vendor fraud. Same pattern, different businesses. When she sees this, she'll recognize the template. You trust her? I worked with her predecessor at the IRS for 6 years. She's good. And when a retired IRS criminal investigator walks in with a 3-inch binder of documented fraud, it carries weight that a phone call from a civilian never will." He dialed. I listened to his end of the conversation from the doorway, leaning against the frame with my arms crossed. Bo's voice shifted into a register I hadn't heard before. Clipped, precise, the Bayou drawl stripped down to pure information. He described the shell companies, the invoicing pattern, the dollar amounts, the trust provisions. He mentioned Margaret by name, said she'd flagged the vendors before her death. He hung up after 8 minutes. She wants the binder. I'm driving it to Nashville tomorrow. She's interested? She said, the vendor pattern matches 3 other cases she's working. Same structure. Same kind of shell registrations. She didn't say it, but I could hear it. This fits something she's already building. I drove Bo to Nashville Wednesday morning. He carried the binder in the banker's box on his lap, one hand resting on the lid, the way you'd rest a hand on something you'd built and didn't want to break. I dropped him at the TBI field office on Mainstream Drive and parked in a lot across the street. He was inside for 2 hours. When he came out, he climbed into the truck without a word and buckled his seatbelt. Well, I said. She took it. She's reviewing the full package. Said she'd call within 48 hours. We drove back to the motel. Bo ordered a pizza and worked on his laptop. I sat in the truck in the parking lot, watching the sun drop behind the tree line west of the interstate. The sky turned pink, then orange, then a bruised purple that reminded me of the smoke rings on a slow-cooked brisket. The kind you get when the fire runs clean and the wood is dry and everything holds its place for hours. Margaret's ledger sat in the grocery bag on the passenger seat. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. The 48 hours stretched like curing concrete. I spent Thursday in my garage, with Margaret's boxes open around me, reading through her files from the trust attorney, looking at each document with new eyes. I drove past the smokehouse once. Troy's BMW was there. The Edison bulbs glowed through the windows. I kept going. Friday morning, I sat at the workbench with a cup of coffee and the wooden plaque in front of me. Built by hand, served with heart. I ran my thumb across the carved letters and waited. The call came Friday evening. 46 hours. Bo answered on the first ring. I was sitting across the motel desk from him, holding a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold. Bo listened for 90 seconds. He didn't write anything down. His face didn't change. When he hung up, he set the phone on the desk and folded his hands. Tell Mr. Stegman we're moving on this. His voice dropped, and something came through that I hadn't heard from Bo before. Not sentiment, recognition. One professional acknowledging another. And tell him his wife did half my job for me. I set the coffee down. Steady hand. She's opening a formal investigation. Not a question. A confirmation. Bo nodded. The TBI is moving on Troy Vandermeer for financial fraud, money laundering, and vendor scheme embezzlement. Salazar's folding it into her regional case gives her jurisdiction and resources she wouldn't have on a standalone complaint. She wants to coordinate the arrest timing with us. With us. She wants it public. Dinner service. Full restaurant. Maximum documentation. Minimum chance he destroys evidence or runs. Bo paused. She asked if he wanted to be there. I looked at the binder-shaped gap on the desk, where the evidence had sat for 3 days. At the sticky notes still taped to the bathroom mirror. At the beds still covered in paper. A room off exit 37, where a Cajun accountant from Baton Rouge had spent a week turning a dead woman's recipe book into a criminal case. Yeah, I said, I want to be there. Bo picked up his phone again and started to dial. Then he stopped. One more thing, Virgil. What? Margaret's ledger. When this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, that book is going to be Exhibit A, a dying woman's handwritten evidence against the man who stole her husband's life's work. He set the phone down. I've processed a lot of fraud cases. 22 years worth. I've never seen anything like what she put together. The reversion clause alone would take a corporate attorney a week to draft. She wrote it by hand in a recipe book between the ham glaze and the pie crust. He picked up the phone and dialed Salazar's number. I sat in the motel room and listened to him plan the arrest of my son-in-law. On the workbench at home, the wooden plaque waited beside Margaret's open boxes. Built by hand, served with heart. She'd built something I couldn't see to protect everything I could touch. And now I could feel her hand in every page of that binder, every tab, every annotated connection between a shell company and a stolen dollar. Not her absence, her architecture. My hands rested on the desk. Not gripping, not clenched. Ready. Detective Salazar wanted the arrest during dinner service. She explained it to Beau on the phone Wednesday morning, and Beau relayed it to me across the motel desk with the same flat precision he'd used to trace Troy's shell companies. The heater still ran broken on its highest setting. Both beds were still buried under paper. Public venue. Full house. Maximum witnesses. Minimum chance of evidence, destruction, or flight. She'd positioned 2 TBI agents in plain clothes inside the restaurant, 30 minutes before the team moved in, seated at separate tables, ordering food like any other customer. A third agent would cover the rear exit by the kitchen. Salazar herself would enter through the front door with badges visible at the designated time. She wants Friday, Beau said. Dinner rush. The restaurant peaks between 7 and 8:30. Friday works. Beau studied me. She also wants to know if you intend to be present. I do, she figured. He folded his hands on the desk. I told her you'd want time with Troy before the team comes in. She's not thrilled about it. How much time? I asked. For 30 minutes. She gave us 20. I'll be present as a witness. No wire. No recording device. Nothing that could compromise the criminal case. This part is personal, not evidentiary. 20 minutes. I'd spent 30 years building that restaurant and 18 months grieving inside a garage. 20 minutes to sit across from the man who stole it was more than enough. One more thing, Beau said. Salazar wants Kristen there. I'll handle that. I called my daughter Thursday evening. She picked up on the 4th ring. Her voice guarded the way it had been for months, the voice of a woman holding too many things together and losing grip on all of them. Dad, I need you to come to the smokehouse tomorrow night, around 8. A pause. Why? It's important. That's all I can tell you right now. Dad, if this is about the smoker, it's not about the smoker. Be there at 8. Come in through the front. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. I heard Troy's voice in the background, muffled, and then Kristen's hand covering the phone. When she came back, her voice was thinner. Okay? I hung up. Set the phone on the workbench beside the recipe ledger. The garage was cold, the December air pressing through the gaps in the framing. I looked at Margaret's boxes, still open from the week I'd spent going through them. The wooden plaque leaned against the wall where I'd set it 7 months ago. Built by hand, served with heart. Tomorrow, Friday evening. Clean flannel, dark green, the one Margaret bought me 3 Christmases ago. Margaret's leather-banded watch went on my left wrist. The crystal was scratched from 30 years of knocking against smoker grates and brick walls. But the movement still kept perfect time. She'd given it to me for our 20th anniversary. Told me a man who builds things with his hands should wear a watch that was built the same way. I picked up the recipe ledger from the workbench, wrapped it in the rooster dish towel, set it in the paper grocery bag along with 2 photocopies I'd made of the reversion clause, one for Troy, one for the record. Beau was waiting in his Tahoe in the Comfort Lodge parking lot. He'd changed into a clean button-down, tucked in, reading glasses in his shirt pocket, instead of hanging from the lanyard. The evidence binder sat on the passenger seat in its white 3-ring cover, 3 inches of documentation, tabs and index sheets visible along the edge. He looked at me through the window. Ready? I climbed in. Set the grocery bag between my feet. Drive. We took Route 11. The same road I'd driven 10,000 times, past the gravel lot where Earl Cutler's feed store used to stand, past the concrete anchor bolt still visible in the ground where my horse trailer had been chained in 1993. The smokehouse came into view at the curve, lit from inside, the parking lot full. Troy's BMW sat in the spot closest to the front door. Margaret's spot. Every light in the building was on. Beau parked the Tahoe 3 spaces from the entrance. We sat in the dark for a moment. Salazar's people are already inside, Beau said. 2 agents, seated. The 3rd is covering the kitchen exit. She enters at 8:20. That gives us 20 minutes from when we sit down. I checked Margaret's watch. 7:48. Let's go. The front door of the smokehouse was heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I'd been away long enough that the weight of it surprised me. I pulled it open and stepped inside. A wall of sound and heat and kitchen grease hit me. 120 seats, and every one of them occupied. The Edison bulbs Troy had installed cast warm amber light across tables I didn't recognize, chairs I'd never bought, a bar area where the sweet tea station used to stand. Cocktail glasses caught the light. Branded signage hung where Margaret's dedication wall had been. Sleek gray letters, no history, no heart. The air smelled like hickory smoke and fried onions, and underneath it, the 30 years of fire baked into the walls that no rebrand could strip out. I took 3 steps into the dining room and stopped. Heads turned, not all at once. The way ripples move across water, starting at the nearest table and spreading outward. The man in a plaid shirt looked up from his plate, and his fork stopped moving. The woman beside him touched his arm. 2 tables over, an older couple I recognized from the volunteer fire department dinner, the wife leaned toward her husband and said something I couldn't hear but didn't need to. Behind them, a family of 4. The father stared. The mother turned in her seat. They knew me. 30 years of serving these people, brisket and sweet tea and conversation across a counter. They'd watched me pour the parking lot. They'd eaten at Margaret's tables. They'd read her chalkboard menu every morning. And now I was standing in the doorway of my own restaurant, and every face that turned carried the same expression: recognition, confusion, and relief. I walked through the dining room. The whispers followed. Troy saw me from the far end of the room. He'd been standing near the bar, talking to a waitress I didn't recognize. His posture relaxed, the Tag Heuer Monaco on his wrist catching the Edison bulbs every time he gestured. His smile dropped the moment our eyes met. His jaw tightened. His hand went to the watch band, adjusting it once before he caught himself. He crossed the dining room in long strides, weaving between tables, his face controlled, but his pace too fast for casual. He stopped 3 feet from me and dropped his voice low enough that only I could hear. "I told you not to come here without an invitation, old man." I didn't answer. I walked past him, through the dining room, past the tables and the cocktail glasses and the branded signage, to the corner booth. The booth where Margaret and I used to sit after closing, counting receipts, drinking the last of the sweet tea, talking about nothing and everything, while the kitchen crew cleaned up around us. Different table surface now, different upholstery, but the same position, the same sight lines to the kitchen pass, the same view of the front door. I sat down, set the paper grocery bag on the seat beside me, unwrapped the ledger from the dish towel and placed it on the table, the cracked leather spine facing Troy, Margaret's grease-stained pages visible at the edges. Troy followed me to the booth. He stood over the table, hands on his hips, jaw working. "What is that? Your wife's cookbook?" He glanced at the ledger, the way you'd glance at a piece of junk mail. "This isn't the time for nostalgia, Virgil." "Sit down, Troy." 2 words. I said them the way I'd say, "Close the damper," or "Check the firebox." No heat, no volume. The The voice of the man who'd built every wall in this building and knew where every load-bearing joint sat. Troy sat. Not because he chose to. His legs bent before his brain caught up, the way a man sits when the voice giving the order belongs to someone who built the chair underneath him. Confusion moved across his face. His hand went to the watchband again, tightening, loosening. Bo slid into the booth beside me. He set the 3-inch evidence binder on the table next to the ledger. White cover, unmarked spine, tabs visible along the edge, color-coded in the system he'd used at the IRS for 22 years. Troy's eyes moved from the ledger to the binder. His fingers stopped on the watch clasp. "Who's this?" he said, looking at Bo. "Prest, a friend of Margaret's," I said. "He's here to listen." I opened the ledger, past the pulled pork rub, past the brisket variations, past the coleslaw and the pie crust and the holiday specials. I turned to the final pages, where Margaret's handwriting changed, where the flowing cursive compressed into tight, urgent letters pressed hard into the paper. I read aloud Margaret's words, the vendor names she'd circled in red, the dollar amounts she'd written beside them. Volunteer Ridge Supply, $47,000. I looked at Troy. Hickory Creek Provisions, $83,000. Smoky Bend Distributors, $112,000. Troy's smirk held. The mask was good. 4 years of practicing it. None of these names match any supplier I've contracted with in 30 years of running this restaurant. I turned the page, and this. In her hand, Troy is routing payments through 3 shell companies. The numbers are here. Finish what I started. I paused. Her words, not mine. Troy leaned forward. His voice came out strained. Margaret didn't know what she was looking at. She was sick. She was confused. She was the sharpest bookkeeper I ever met, Bo said from beside me. His voice was flat, Bayou accent stripped to nothing. And she wasn't confused. I reached into the ledger and pulled out the notarized page, laid it flat on the table between us. The notary seal caught the light. April 12, 2023. 6 months before Margaret died. Ownership reversion clause, I said. Drafted, witnessed, and notarized independently of the papers you had me sign. It states that operational control of the smokehouse reverts to my sole authority upon documented evidence of fraud. Troy stared at the seal. His jaw worked side to side. The papers you put in front of me transferred day-to-day operations, I said. Management authority, vendor decisions, staffing. What they did not transfer, what they could not transfer, was property ownership. The smokehouse is held in the Stegman Family Trust. Margaret structured it in 2011. The trust requires both trustees' signatures for ownership transfer. She never signed your papers, Troy. She was already dead. I let the silence sit for 3 seconds. The building, the land, the parking lot I poured, the smoker I welded. It belongs to me. It always did. Troy slammed his palms on the table. The glasses rattled. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. Heads turned. You think a piece of paper your dead wife hid in a cookbook is going to hold up? His voice cracked on the word cookbook. The polish was gone. What came through was flatter, harder. The voice of a car dealership manager's son from a Nashville suburb who'd spent his whole life pretending to be something he wasn't. I'll have my lawyer bury you. The threat landed with the weight of an empty plate. He was standing in a restaurant I owned, wearing a watch purchased with money he'd stolen from me, threatening me with a lawyer he'd have to pay with funds I could trace to the penny. Sit down, Troy. I'm not finished. He sat. His hand shook on the table. The watch band rattled against the formica. Bo opened the evidence binder. Section A, Bo said. He turned to the first tab. Shell Company registrations. Volunteer Ridge Supply, Registered in Kentucky, July 2022. Single member LLC. Corporate agent service. No real person attached. He turned the page. Hickory Creek Provisions, Georgia. August 2020. Same pattern. Another page. Smoky Bend Distributors, Tennessee, September 2020. 3 states. 3 shell companies. All created within 90 days, 4 months after Margaret's diagnosis. Troy's eyes moved across the pages. His lips parted. No sound came out. Section B. Bo turned to the next tab. Bank statements showing wire transfers from the smokehouse operating account to each shell company. Monthly. Every month for 2 years. He ran his finger down a column of numbers. The real numbers, Troy. Not the figures Margaret had access to from the invoices alone. Volunteer Ridge billed $127,000 last quarter. Actual market cost for the same product, $31,000. Same markup pattern across all 3 vendors. $300,000 per quarter. $1.2 million total. Troy's face lost its color. Not gradually. All at once, like a light switched off behind his skin. Section C. Bo laid out 2 invoices side by side. On the left, the original vendor contract signed by Virgil and Margaret with Henley Meats. $12 a pound for choice brisket. On the right, Volunteer Ridge Supply, billing the smokehouse $41 a pound for the same grade. He looked at Troy. These original contracts were preserved by a staff member who noticed the discrepancies. Section D. Bo turned to the lifestyle spending traces. Tag Heuer Monaco, $6,400. Purchased March 2023 from a jewelry store in Nashville. Payment traced to the same account, receiving wire transfers from Volunteer Ridge Supply. He turned the page. Omega Seamaster, $5,200. Tudor Black Bay, $3,800. 4 additional watches totaling $14,000. BMW lease. Monthly payments from an account linked to Hickory Creek Provisions. Troy stared at the binder. At the printed bank statements with his name on every page. At the highlighted transaction lines connecting his watch purchases to the shell companies. At 22 years of IRS training compressed into 3 inches of indexed, annotated documentation. He reached for his phone in his pocket. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," I said. The front door opened. 3 people entered. A woman in a dark blazer led, flanked by 2 men in suits. All 3 wore badges clipped to their belts, visible, catching the light the way Troy's watches used to catch it. Every head in the dining room turned. 120 people watched Detective Anita Salazar of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation walk through the restaurant I'd built, past the tables filled with the community I'd fed for 30 years, straight to the corner booth. The room went silent. Not the gradual quiet of a dying conversation. The sudden, complete silence of 120 people holding their breath at the same time. Salazar stopped at the edge of the booth. She looked at Troy the way I look at a smoker with a cracked firebox. Something past fixing. Troy Vandermeer? Troy didn't move. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for financial fraud, money laundering, and elder financial exploitation. She reached for the handcuffs on her belt. "Stand up and put your hands where I can see them." Troy didn't move. An agent put a hand on his elbow and lifted. Troy's body went rigid, then limp, the fight leaving him the way air leaves a punctured tire. The handcuffs closed around his wrists at the table where Margaret and I used to count the night's receipts. The click of the mechanism was the only sound in the room. Metal on metal, a small noise in a room where 120 forks had stopped moving. They pulled Troy to his feet. He looked smaller in handcuffs. The polo shirt hung wrong on his shoulders. The tag heuer Monaco dangled on his wrist at an angle, the clasp loose, the weight of it pulling his hand down. They walked him through the dining room, past the tables he'd rebranded, past the bar where sweet tea pitchers used to sit, past staff members who stopped mid-stride with plates in their hands. The girl who'd asked me if I had a reservation stood frozen at the hostess stand, the tablet dark in her hand, watching the man who'd hired her leave in handcuffs. Darlene stood at the kitchen pass, her thick arms at her sides, her face showing nothing. She watched Troy walk past the way you watch weather move through. No satisfaction, no grief, just witness. The front door opened again. Kristen stood in the entrance, her coat half-buttoned, her hair loose. Her hand rose to her mouth. Troy saw her. "Call my lawyer." His voice broke. "Kristen, call my lawyer." She didn't move. Her hand stayed over her mouth. Her eyes found mine across the dining room, and what I saw in them wasn't confusion or anger. It was the look of a woman watching the last wall give way. Troy said it again as the agents guided him through the door. "Kristen, call my—" The door closed behind him. The dining room stayed quiet for another 5 seconds. Then someone coughed. A fork touched a plate. The kitchen exhaust fan hummed through the pass. The sounds of a restaurant returning to itself, the way a field sounds after thunder moves on. Kristen stood in the entrance without moving. I didn't go to her, not yet. That conversation would come, but not tonight, not in front of 120 people. I held her gaze long enough for her to know I wasn't angry. Then she turned and walked back through the front door into the parking lot. I sat in the corner booth with the recipe ledger open in front of me. The Edison bulbs Troy had installed cast warm light across Margaret's handwriting, the tight, urgent cursive of her vendor notes, the notary seal, the line that had started everything. "He's stealing from us." Bo sat beside me, the evidence binder closed now, his hands folded on the table. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I ran my thumb across the ledger's cracked spine. The leather was warm from the heat of the dining room, hickory fat and old paper. 30 years of recipes and 1 page of justice, hidden between the ham glaze and the pie crust by a woman who knew she was dying and refused to let that be the end of it. The kitchen sounds came through the pass. Plates, pans, Darlene's voice giving an order I couldn't make out. The restaurant running the way it had for 30 years. Because the people who raised it to last. I closed the ledger, held it against my chest. The leather pressed into my flannel, the cracked spine against my forearms. The table surface under my free hand was different from what I remembered. Smoother, cheaper. But the seat faced the same direction, the same view of the front door, the same sight line to the kitchen pass where Margaret used to wave goodnight to the crew. The booth was mine again. The TBI came back on Monday. 3 agents. 2 of them I recognized from Friday night. The agents who'd sat at separate tables eating brisket while they waited for Salazar's signal. The third was new, a woman in a dark windbreaker with TBI stenciled across the back, carrying a hard-sided case that looked like it held camera equipment. I wasn't there when they executed the warrant. Bo told me later, sitting across from me at Darlene's kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between us, that the agents arrived at 9 in the morning with a locksmith and a search warrant signed by a Davidson County judge. Troy's office, the converted storage room at the back of the smokehouse, had a single door, a padlock on the filing cabinet, and no windows. The locksmith opened the padlock in 40 seconds. Inside the filing cabinet, behind a row of hanging folders labeled with Troy's corporate vocabulary, the agents found what Bo's forensic analysis had predicted they would find. Invoices from all 3 shell companies, organized by month, each one matching the inflated billing pattern Bo had traced through Margaret's flagged vendor names. Bank routing numbers, handwritten on a yellow legal pad, linking the smokehouse operating account to the shell vendor accounts Troy controlled. And in the desk's top drawer, wrapped in a glasses cloth, a burner phone. The phone was a prepaid model, the kind you buy at a gas station counter. No contract, no name attached. Troy had used it for vendor communications, text messages to the corporate agent services that managed the Shell LLCS, call logs, connecting him to numbers in Kentucky, Georgia, and a different Tennessee area code. The agents bagged it, tagged it, and carried it out of the building in an evidence container alongside the filing cabinet contents, the yellow legal pad, and a laptop Troy had kept separate from the smokehouse's main accounting system. Bo described all of this with his reading glasses on the table and his hands wrapped around the coffee mug Darlene had filled without being asked. They found everything, he said. The routing numbers on that legal pad matched the wire transfers I traced. The burner phone ties Troy directly to the shell company operators. His own handwriting. His own calls. The local news ran the story Tuesday evening. Channel 4 sent a reporter to the smokehouse parking lot. She stood on the concrete I'd poured in 1996, with the building behind her, the branded signage still visible above the door, and told a camera that a son-in-law had been arrested for defrauding a legendary Tennessee barbecue restaurant of over $1 million through a network of shell vendor companies. She called it a scheme targeting a grieving widower. She used the phrase, elder exploitation. She mentioned Margaret by name. By Wednesday, every regular customer who'd eaten at Stegman's in the past 30 years had heard the story. The phone at my ranch house started ringing before breakfast, and didn't stop until I unplugged it after dinner. People I hadn't spoken to in months, in years, called to say they were sorry. They'd suspected something was wrong. They'd noticed the changes. They wished they'd said something sooner. Burl Cutler's son, who still ran the feed store across from the original gravel lot, drove to my house with a case of beer and a handshake that lasted 10 seconds. The TBI's independent investigation confirmed everything Bo had built. $1.2 million siphoned over 2 years through inflated vendor invoices from 3 shell companies. Troy created and controlled. The forensic accountant Salazar brought in ran the same analysis Bo had run in a motel room off exit 37, and they arrived at the same numbers. Bo's work held up. Margaret's work held up. Troy's watches were seized on Thursday. An agent drove to the split-level house where Troy and Kristen lived and collected all 7 from the leather display case in the bedroom, the Tag Heuer Monaco, the Omega Seamaster, the Tudor Black Bay, 4 others I'd never learned the names of. Each one cataloged, photographed, and placed in a labeled evidence bag. Assets, purchased with laundered funds. The status symbols Troy had rotated like costumes, one for every day of the week, the watches he adjusted when he lied. Gone. The BMW went on Friday. A flatbed truck backed into the smokehouse parking lot and loaded Troy's leased dark blue sedan. The car that had occupied Margaret's parking spot for 2 years. The car that sat on concrete I'd poured with my own hands. The flatbed driver didn't know the history. He just hooked the chains, winched the car onto the bed, and drove it away. The spot where it had been was stained with transmission fluid, a dark oval on the gray concrete. I looked at it for a long time. The 3 Shell LLCS were dissolved by state order the following week. Volunteer Ridge Supply, Hickory Creek Provisions, Smoky Bend Distributors. The corporate agent services in Kentucky, Georgia, and Tennessee received dissolution notices, and the companies that had never existed in any real sense ceased to exist in the legal sense too. The invoices stopped. The wire transfers stopped. The fake vendors Margaret had circled in red ink disappeared from every database, leaving nothing behind but the evidence trail that put Troy in a cell. Troy's lawyer, a Nashville defense attorney named Hendricks, who who charged $400 an hour, reviewed the evidence binder and the TBI's findings. He called Troy at the county detention center and told him the truth. Negotiate a plea deal. The case was documented from multiple independent sources. Margaret's ledger, Beau's forensic analysis, Darlene's original contracts, the TBI's search warrant recovery, Troy's own handwriting on the legal pad, his own calls on the burner phone. Every avenue of defense led to the same wall. Troy refused. "I'll fight this," he told Hendricks. That's what Beau heard from Salazar, who heard it from the prosecutor's office. Troy Vandermeer, sitting in a county jumpsuit without a watch on his wrist, told his $400 an hour lawyer that he would fight a case built on 3 inches of evidence, a dead woman's handwriting, and his own recorded communications. Nobody called him back. Not the restaurant contacts he'd cultivated. Not the Nashville networking connections he'd collected the way he collected watches. Things to display, not to use. Not the social media managers or the influencers he'd lined up for the rebrand. His phone, the real phone, the one the court allowed him to use for legal calls, sat silent in his hand for hours at a time. The man who'd talked about brand equity and scalable operations couldn't find a single person willing to take his call. Salazar met with Kristen on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the arrest. Beau told me about it that evening. Salazar had brought photographs of the forged vendor signatures, the bank routing numbers Troy had written on the legal pad, and a printed timeline documenting the elder exploitation pattern. How Troy had presented the transfer papers during my deepest grief. How he'd restricted Miles's visits to isolate me from family support. Kristen hadn't known about the laundering. Troy had kept her outside the financial operations, the way he'd kept everyone outside. Locked door, padlocked cabinet, burner phone. She knew the restaurant was making money. She knew Troy spent more than she expected. She didn't know where it came from because Troy had built the scheme specifically so she wouldn't ask. When Salazar showed her the evidence, Kristen stopped talking. She sat in the TBI field office and looked at the documents spread across the table, at her husband's handwriting on the routing numbers, at the timeline showing how he'd used her, and she didn't speak for 11 minutes. Salazar waited. Kristen came to the ranch house 3 days later. I heard her car in the driveway at 4 in the afternoon. I was on the wraparound porch, in the chair I'd sat in every evening for 20 years, the wood warm from the afternoon sun, Margaret's garden visible at the side of the house. The garden had gone to seed since she died. Weeds through the rosemary. Dead stalks where the tomatoes used to stand. Kristen climbed the porch steps and sat in the chair beside mine. Margaret's chair. She didn't look at me right away. She looked at the garden, at the dead stalks and the weeds and the bare soil where her mother had spent 30 years planting and pruning and feeding the earth. Then she looked at me and something passed between us. The garden and the father, both neglected, both still here. She sat there for 2 full minutes before she spoke. "I helped him do this to you." Her voice was level. Not defensive, not breaking. The voice of a woman who'd spent 3 days reading bank statements until the numbers stopped lying. "I told you to sign those papers. I told you to rest. I told you Troy had it under control." She turned and looked at me. Her eyes were dry. She'd done her crying somewhere else. What I saw was something worse than tears. It was the look of a person who understood exactly what they'd done and had no excuse to offer. I stood in the kitchen doorway and told my father to stop worrying about his own restaurant. "I handed you a pen." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod or shake my head or shift in my chair. I let her words land on the porch boards between us and sit there, the way you let mortar set before you test the joint. She finished. The garden was quiet. A mockingbird sat on the fence post where Margaret used to hang the bird feeder. The afternoon light fell across the porch, at the angle it always did at 4 o'clock in December, low and gold, reaching the arm of Margaret's chair. "Your mother saw it before any of us," I said. "She didn't blame you either." Kristen's hands gripped the arms of the chair. Her knuckles went white. She looked away from me, toward the garden, toward the dead stalks Margaret had planted, and her jaw tightened the way mine did when I couldn't say what I needed to say. She nodded. "Once. That was enough." Kristen filed for divorce the following week. She cooperated with the TBI without conditions, providing testimony about Troy's behavioral patterns, his obsessive control over the office, the locked door, and the padlock he carried on his keyring, the way he scheduled Miles's weekends to conflict with my visits. She testified about the watch purchases she'd noticed but never questioned, about the BMW payments she'd assumed came from restaurant profits, about the 4 years Troy had spent studying the business before Margaret's diagnosis gave him the opening he'd been building toward. Her testimony about restricting Miles's access to me strengthened the elder exploitation charges. Salazar documented a pattern of deliberate isolation, a vulnerable adult separated from family support during a period of documented grief. Troy hadn't just stolen money. He'd engineered the conditions that made the theft possible. My attorney, Howard Marsh, was the same man who drafted the original Stegman family trust at Margaret's request in 2011. Howard was 71, semi-retired, and kept copies of every document he'd ever filed in a climate-controlled storage unit behind his office in Nashville. When I called him the day after the arrest, he pulled the trust documents within an hour. Howard filed the paperwork to reclaim operational control of the smokehouse on a Wednesday. The notarized reversion clause, independently witnessed and triggered by documented fraud, was presented alongside the original trust provisions Margaret had structured. Troy's transfer papers, the documents I'd signed in my kitchen while my daughter stood in the doorway telling me to rest, were formally voided. The court order came back in 8 days. Property ownership had never transferred. The building, the land, the parking lot, the smoker, every brick I'd laid, and every slab of concrete I'd poured, mine. The way it had been since 1993. The way Margaret had made sure it would always be. My first call as restored owner went to the demolition company. Cancel the order on the smoker. The foreman who answered didn't ask questions. He just pulled the work ticket. My second call went to Billy Crawford. Then Maria Espinoza. Then James Beckett. Then 3 others Troy had replaced with cheaper hires who didn't know the difference between a brisket flat and a packer. "Come back," I told each of them. Same position, same pay or better. Billy didn't speak for 10 seconds after I said it. Then he cleared his throat and said he'd be there Monday. Darlene got a raise. I told her the number at her kitchen table, the same scarred oak surface where we'd spread the vendor contracts weeks earlier. She looked at the figure on the paper I'd written it on, folded it once, and put it in her apron pocket. "About time," she said. I started on the dining room the next day. The Edison bulbs came down first. I stood on a step stool and unscrewed each one, setting them in the same cardboard boxes Troy had used to ship Margaret's dedication wall to my garage. His packaging. My undoing of it. The cocktail menu cards went into a recycling bin. The branded signage came off the walls with a screwdriver and left screw holes I'd fill and paint over. The minimalist furniture, the sleek chairs, and the narrow tables that looked like they belonged in a magazine instead of a barbecue restaurant, I sold to a consignment dealer in Nashville for less than Troy had paid and didn't care about the difference. I drove to my garage and loaded the truck, the hand-lettered chalkboard menu, the framed photograph of opening day, the wooden plaque. I hung the chalkboard first, mounting it on the same hooks Margaret had installed. Her handwriting from 1993, the white paint pen fading but still readable, pulled pork, $3 allers. Brisket plate, 5. Sweet tea, 1. I'd update the prices later. The handwriting stayed. The photograph went back on the wall beside it. Virgil and Margaret. Opening day. Squinting into the sun. Cigar box under her arm. My stained apron. Earl Cutler's disposable camera, capturing two people who had no idea what they were starting. The wooden plaque went last. I held it against the wall, feeling the weight of the reclaimed barn wood, the depth of the carved letters under my thumb. The mounting bracket caught with a click I felt through my palm. I'd held this plaque against my chest on the garage floor 7 months ago, surrounded by packing peanuts and motor oil, sitting in the dark while my restaurant operated without me. Now, I set it on the bracket Margaret had chosen, in the position she had measured, at the height she had specified when she stood on a step stool while I held her steady, built by hand, served with heart. The smokehouse came back in pieces. The worn wooden tables I'd kept in storage. The sweet tea pitchers Darlene had saved in the kitchen pantry. The warmth and noise of 30 years of cooking that no rebrand could strip from the walls, no matter how many Edison bulbs you hung from the ceiling. The weeks between December and March passed in a rhythm of restoration and legal machinery. Troy's trial came 4 months after the arrest. Hendricks, his lawyer, had spent those months explaining reality to a man who didn't want to hear it. The evidence was documented from 6 independent sources. The burner phone records alone would convict him. The handwritten routing numbers on the legal pad. Margaret's annotated vendor list. Beau's forensic trail. Darlene's original contract comparisons. The TBI's search warrant recovery. Every piece confirmed every other piece. There was no angle, no defense, no version of the story where Troy Vandermeer was innocent. Troy accepted the plea deal in March. The same deal Hendricks had recommended the week after the arrest. 4 months of pretending he'd fight. 4 months of silence from every contact he'd ever cultivated. And he signed the paper his lawyer put in front of him. A signature given when the walls close in. The difference was what built those walls. The judge gave him 5 years total. 3 inside. 2 on a leash. 3 years in state prison for financial fraud and money laundering. The judge cited the scale of the operation. 3 shell companies across 3 states. $1.2 million siphoned over 2 years, and the sophistication of the vendor invoicing scheme. 2 years probation for elder financial exploitation. The judge noted that Troy had targeted a grieving widower during a period of documented vulnerability, presenting complex legal documents during acute bereavement and systematically isolating the victim from family support. An aggravating factor under Tennessee law. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd already moved past Troy Vandermeer. He'd occupied enough of my time. That Wednesday evening, I drove to the smokehouse after the dinner crew had cleaned up and gone home. The parking lot was empty. My truck sat alone on the concrete I'd poured, the crack from Troy's BMW still visible in the slab, but already weathering into the surface the way old damage does when you stop looking at it. I walked around to the back patio. The corrugated tin roof I'd built to shelter the smoker threw shadows across the concrete in the security light's glow. The smoker sat where it had sat for 31 years. 800 pounds of salvaged steel and seasoned metal. The curved surface of the oil drum body black and smooth from 3 decades of fire. I opened the firebox door. The hinges were stiff. I worked them back and forth until they moved clean, then loaded hickory splits from the wood rack against the patio wall. The logs were dry, aged 6 months. I stacked them in the firebox, the way I'd stacked them 10,000 times, the way I'd taught Miles to stack them, the way my hands knew without my brain telling them. I struck a match. The hickory caught on the first try. The flame curled around the split ends of the wood and climbed, and the firebox began to draw. Heat moved through the steel. The cooking chamber warmed, and the smoker, the steel I'd cut and welded in a rented garage in 1993, responded to the fire the way it always had. The metal expanded. The seasoned surface released its smell, hickory and pecan and cherry and oak. Layers of smoke baked into the grain, warming out of the steel and rising into the night air. Blue smoke, clean combustion. The wood was dry and the fire was right. I heard footsteps on the patio. I didn't turn around. I knew the walk. Short stride, heavy heel, the cadence of a woman who'd spent 30 years crossing kitchen floors in non-slip shoes. Darlene stopped beside me. Her arms crossed over her chest, the same posture she'd held when she watched Troy walk through the dining room in handcuffs. She looked at the smoke rising from the chamber, curling up past the corrugated tin roof and dissolving into the dark sky above the tree line. She didn't speak. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the smoke didn't already say. The fire burned. The steel held its heat. The smoke rose from the smoker I'd built with my own hands. The smoker Troy had scheduled for demolition. The smoker Margaret had protected by hiding a legal weapon between the coleslaw and the pie crust. The fire popped once inside the chamber, a sharp crack of hickory giving up its sap, and the sound echoed off the corrugated tin above us and faded into the quiet. 31 years of seasoning, 31 years of fire. And now, for the first time in over a year, the steel was warm again. I stood on the patio with my hands at my sides and watched the smoke climb. Darlene stood beside me with her arms crossed and watched it too. The night air was cold against my face, and the fire was hot against my hands, and the hickory smelled the way hickory has always smelled, when the wood is right and the fire is clean and the steel remembers what it was built for. If you're feeling my revenge, hit like and drop a rating from 1 to 10 with your thoughts. I appreciate you. 6 months after sentencing, the ranch house held voices again. Kristen and Miles had moved in at the end of March. I didn't ask her to. She called one evening and said she'd given up the lease on the split level, and before she could finish the sentence, I told her the spare rooms were ready. They'd been ready since Margaret furnished them in 2004, one for Christine when she visited, one for a grandchild who hadn't been born yet. The garden was the first thing Kristen touched. Not the house, not her old bedroom, not the kitchen. The garden. She went out on a Saturday morning in April with a pair of Margaret's pruning shears and started cutting back the dead stalks I'd let stand for 2 years. She didn't ask permission. She didn't explain what she was doing. She knelt in the cold soil where her mother had planted rosemary and tomatoes and lavender, and she cut away what had died. By June, green shoots pushed through. New growth in the beds Margaret had built from cedar boards and topsoil she'd hauled in a wheelbarrow. Kristen watered them every morning before driving Miles to school. She never mentioned it. I never mentioned it. The garden spoke for both of us. The smokehouse filled up again. Not with the crowd Troy had drawn, people who ordered cocktails and took pictures of food they didn't finish. The people who came back were the ones who'd been coming for 30 years. Fire department on Tuesdays. Church groups on Wednesdays. Families who remembered when Margaret wrote the specials on a chalkboard every morning in her exact, upright hand. I tended the smoker on the back patio under the corrugated tin roof, the same station I'd worked for 30 years. The steel held heat the way it always had. Blue smoke rose clean through the spring air and the summer air, and by August, the cooking chamber had recovered its full seasoning. The layered depth of 3 decades of fire baked back into the grain. Darlene ran the kitchen with Billy and Maria and James beside her, the crew Troy had fired. Reassembled at the same stations they'd held for years. She didn't soften with them back. If anything, she got harder. The standards went up. The plates went out right. Nobody questioned it. Beau drove up from Baton Rouge in May and again in July. Both times, he sat at the counter and ordered the brisket plate and a glass of sweet tea. And both times, I told him his money was no good here. He argued the first time. The second time, He just put his wallet away and ate. Margaret's recipe ledger sat in a glass case I'd built and mounted by the entrance, beside the restored dedication wall. I'd opened the ledger to the brisket rub page. The first recipe, 1993, her schoolteacher cursive listing the ingredients by weight, because volume measurements were guesswork and weight was truth. The case was simple. Cedar frame, single pane, a small brass latch. Customers stopped to read it on their way in. Some of them stood there for a long time. The wooden plaque hung beside it. Built by hand, served with heart. The photograph of opening day. The chalkboard menu. Sunday evening. Late September. The air had that Tennessee quality where summer lets go and fall hasn't decided how cool to be yet. Warm enough to sit outside without moving. Cool enough that you noticed the season turning. Miles and I sat on the wraparound porch in the chairs where Margaret and I used to close out every night. He was 12 now, long-legged, his sneakers hanging off the edge of the porch boards. His hands were rough at the fingertips from handling firewood, calluses forming in the same places mine had formed 40 years ago. I held Margaret's watch in my palm. The leather band was cracked and dark from 3 decades of smoke and sweat. The crystal had a scratch across 9 o'clock from the time I'd knocked it against the firebox door in 2007. Miles looked at it. "Grandma gave you that?" "20th anniversary," I said. "She told me a man who builds things with his hands should wear a watch that was built the same way." He turned it over in his fingers when I handed it to him. Careful, the way I'd taught him to handle the firebox damper. Respect what you're touching. "She was smart," Miles said. "Your grandmother was 10 steps ahead of all of us," I said, "even from the grave." Miles held the watch up. The evening light caught the crystal and threw a small bar of gold across his wrist. He studied it the way he studied smoke color, reading it, learning it. The field beyond the driveway was quiet. Somewhere down the road, a mockingbird called twice and stopped. "Grandpa, yeah. Can I write my own recipes? In a new ledger, like hers?" I looked at my grandson. Margaret's eyes looked back at me. Dark brown. Watchful. Older now than the last time I'd searched them. Carrying something that hadn't been there a year ago. I smiled. Not the careful, measured expression I'd held in place for 2 years. A real one. Full. The muscles in my face remembered how. "I think she'd like that,"